Hello and welcome to another edition of the Prosecutor's Partners. I'm Dan Satterberg, King County Prosecuting Attorney. This is a show where we introduce you to some of the people who are working for justice in King County. And today, a very special show, and a partner of mine for the last 35 years. I'm welcoming Mark Larson, the Chief of the Criminal Division of the King County Prosecutor's Office. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Dan.
So I'm going to take you back memory lane a little bit. When I first met you in 1984, we were fresh interns. This was during the Reagan administration. It was a long time ago. We were Rule 9 interns at the same time, and then we've been together for 35 years. And I've always, first want to say how much I've admired you and how much I've relied on you to get our work done.
Thanks, Dan. We have marked a lot of time there, but also done a lot of amazing work, and that's sort of what sticks in my memory.
Take me back into your amazing family. I know you've had a strong and loving family led by famous minister Bruce Larson. What was it like to be the son of the preacher man?
Well, my dad was sort of an itinerant preacher. He did a lot of different missional work, some in churches, some out of churches, but he was very much of a guy who believed in something called relational theology. And that was sort of the way that messages get conveyed to people. That you can read something or you can hear a sermon, but one-to-one is really kind of where important matters, including faith matters, sort of transact. And he was a believer in that his whole life, and kind of imparted that to me, I think, in his own way. But there were times when I strained under the Reverend Dr. Bruce Larson and rebelled in my own ways through most of my teenage years before I finally left a life of crime and decided to go to law school and become a prosecutor.
So you grew up in Florida?
Kind of eastern seaboard, New Jersey, Maryland, and finally in southwest Florida in a tiny little cell down there.
So when your dad's the minister, you go wherever the minister goes.
You go where the minister goes, and that took us to a lot of different places and interesting moves and changes in our lives.
When you went to college at Florida State University, what was it that you wanted to be at that time?
Well, I didn't know until I got there, but pretty quickly I sort of became really interested in criminal justice, and I think my interest in people, in sociology, psychology, and the courts kind of blended together in a couple of classes I had. I remember reading my first ever sort of case law, and I think it might have been a Miranda decision or one of those that was timely then and now. But I remember thinking there was this whole story that sort of played out in the life of this case, and there were holdings, but there were facts and people and dramas playing out, and it really captivated me. So that was I remember vividly just making that decision that criminal justice was what I wanted to pursue.
But you didn't go to law school right away.
Did not go to law. In fact, it really didn't conceive that was possible. I just didn't. I thought that was for really smart people, and I didn't consider myself that. But I was sort of a struggling law undergraduate, and I got my degree, and I worked for a couple of years as a probation officer in the Fort Lauderdale area in Florida before I decided to get the courage and apply to law school.
So you were 21, 22-year-old probation officer. How did that experience shape your life?
Dan, I'm convinced that as I look back on it that I was probably the worst probation officer in the state of Florida. I had 80 plus adult people under supervision, both some coming out of prison, some which were on probation, so it's parole and probation. And I was supposed to be charged with what they were doing, and I had no good idea what any of them were really doing.
To help them reform from their hardened criminal ways?
As I left to go to law school, I have a memory, whether this is exactly accurate or not, but one of my star kind of pupils came in every month, was always there, never late, had his, whatever his legal financial obligations were, those were paid, and filled out his paperwork, and never missed. And was conning me the whole time. And literally, as I drove out of Fort Lauderdale, he was in a shootout after a bank robbery with the local constabulary. And I thought, well, there you go. I need to move on and do something else.
Good time for a career change. So how did you end up in Seattle?
Well, my dad took a position at a church here in '80, and I'd visited and really I was committed to leaving the state of Florida and going somewhere else and trying my hand. And really just fell in love with the city when I visited a couple of times.
And Reverend Bruce Larson was a fixture at University Presbyterian Church for a long time.
For 10 years, from 80 until 90, he was the senior pastor there.
So UPS Law School?
Yep.
Now Seattle U.
Now,
Did you ever get a new diploma from them?
I don't hang it, though, because I just sort of think that I went to UPS. And so I will tell you this story, though. My diploma, which hangs on my wall, come visit me, was signed by our dean, a great guy, Fred Towson, in felt tip. And if you know what happens to felt tip exposed to light over time, I now have an unsigned diploma from a school that no longer exists. And so I like to think of, it keeps me humble in my, so I think of my roots.
I don't think anybody asks where you go to law school after you get your first job, but
not anymore. They haven't in a while.
So You began as a deputy prosecutor in 1984 as an intern, 85, brand new lawyer. What do you remember about that experience as a brand new deputy prosecutor?
Wow, great question. Just, you know, I remember mostly the feeling of like I didn't know near what I needed to know and kind of being overwhelmed kind of perpetually. I don't know that that's changed a lot over the years. I think we do a little more to prepare people, but you recall that as well. But it was intoxicating. You were teamed with a group of young people who were very similarly situated, and we were all learning something together about how to manage that practice and how to do it well. You probably recall that, you know, at that time, most people still were there 3, 4, 5 years. That would have been typical. 5, 6, 7 would have been unusual. There were very, very few or virtually no career prosecutors. So literally the office was filled with a large number of us that were, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 years of experience. And the person that was there a year longer than you was kind of sage and could teach you a lot. But we were making it up as we went along, Dan.
But not letting people know that.
Working really hard not to have that to be exposed too often, at least.
Can you remember some of the trials that you did back then, or do you remember all of them?
Well, I don't. I can go back and sort of recall them, but I really had. I think a lot of people probably have this sort of sense. There was a pivotal trial for me in a moment, and I was 2 or 3 years into the office, and at that time, what was a celebrated case that came. Back then they had names, the Harborview rape case, and ironically, there was really only one of these 6 cases that had any element of a sexual crime, most not, but it was a serial crime that had happened over a number of months in that area around the hospital, and
just a block or two up from the courthouse where we're sitting right now.
And it got tried once to a hung jury by one of our colleagues, and I was invited to come and do the second trial, the retrial, and participated in that. And I just know that in the course of that probably 3-week trial, really a light went off. And I remember vividly the first time I stood up to speak and to do direct on a witness and being really overcome in the moment. So I think we're just human, and there are times when we just sort of the moment can get the better of us, and I was very inexperienced. By the end of that trial, though, I really felt like I was a different lawyer. My sense of competence and confidence and my ability to sort of do what I needed to. I did closing argument in that case.
And your co-counsel was?
Ann Bremner. And then you'll recall that it was a conviction, but that got reversed by some kind of juror misconduct.
That's right.
That was unknown to us, and we tried it a third time.
3 times is hard.
And Ann had left by then, and Becky Rowe and I tried it a third time. It was a hung jury again. So we had 2 hung juries and a conviction that was reversed, and under Norm's leadership, we decided to call it good.
So talk a little bit about Norm Mailing. He's sort of a mythical figure in this courthouse now. He's been gone for more than 12 years, but you and I knew him pretty well.
Well, you know, I've had 2 really mentors in my life, and my dad was one that you mentioned, but Norm is really the other. And I don't go through a week that I don't have his pithy sayings and kind of philosophical musings in my head and sort of defining how I experience the world. So he's still very much alive as a part of how I kind of view the world. But you know, Dan, what better expression of who he was? He presided over an office that began the reform movement, along with Chris Bailey, of course. He really birthed that whole idea and was a part of it from the beginning. But he also he was full of paradoxes of one sort or another. But he was a guy who was very cautious in some regards, but then in other places he could be, you know, incredibly almost reckless, like asking a guy who'd been in the office for 4 years to be his chief of staff.
That was ridiculous.
Or somebody who'd been in the office for, you know, less than 7 years to be his chief criminal deputy. And those were the sort of things that Norm routinely, he had a vision, and he had confidence and a willingness to take risks on things, programs, people, things that he thought should be accomplished. And that's an amazing legacy that lives on with, I think, both of us.
So you became the chief criminal deputy, and was that 1993, 94?
1993.
Back then, certainly when we joined the office, we had probably half as many criminal prosecutors.
I think almost exactly. I think there was 70 to 80 deputy prosecutors, and we're touching up at about 170 now.
And we had more cases coming to us from the police.
That is the fact, and we did an amazing volume of work. But I will say, and I think it's fair to observe, what a case looked like then and what a case looks like now really were almost, they're very difficult to compare.
Talk about that.
Well, I mean, you did it as well. You and I were trial lawyers for a period of time through the 80s and early 90s, and you could get an entire murder case, and it might represent a couple of inches of paper on your desk. You'd read the witness statements, many of which would be a single page. You would have those, some lab reports, and a couple of other summaries of things. That was the entire file.
Pick a jury in a day.
Pick a jury in a day and try the case in a week, and in 5, 6, 7 days the entire trial would be complete. And you and I would do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those sorts of cases in a single year. Now I think we've got the volume of evidence, and I have to say I'm pleased. Our lives have become the cases have become more dense. The existence of electronic media to both record information from witnesses, from others, the existence of video, cell phones, computer records, cell tower records, I mean, on and on and on. The amount of information we get on any single case is vastly more than it used to be. And while that's a confound in terms of our ability we go slower, I'm persuaded and convinced that it also makes our judgments more accurate. Never perfect. We're humans. We weren't there. We have to sort of go on the evidence that's available to us. But I think it makes our judgments more accurate, and that pleases me.
And juries expect that kind of thorough.
CSI effect is real for certain, and I just think even DNA. We ushered DNA into the courts back probably in the 90s, and it was such a powerful technology, and really changed the way we thought about forensic science broadly as a result. But to go from what used to be the sort of samples you would need to get a profile to now, almost single skin cells can sort of produce profiles. So what does it mean now to find DNA or not find DNA is really changed, but it really was a vanguard of kind of the sort of evidence that we would bring to bear in our cases.
Back when we were doing sexual assault cases in trial, we'd use serology, so just the blood test, and you'd need quite a bit of sample. It couldn't be contaminated, and remember the kind of results that you'd get back from the crime lab.
Yeah, and if people were secretors or not, and blood,
But you could narrow you down to like 30% of the population. Right. We thought that was really good evidence.
And then 5 years later, it was 1 in a quadrillion, and those sorts of results, which really was an amazing leap forward in terms of how we engage science,
and give you a little more confidence that you're prosecuting the right person.
Yeah, I think that's right. But forensic science is still, it's marching forward, and I think there are things from the past which you can look back on and say that wasn't as precise as you would have liked. It was all we could do at the time, but we know so much more now. And I think it adds to our ability to be discerning and to be accurate.
Knowing secretly how unqualified we were to do this very difficult work, and how we hid it well for a couple of years at least. What do you look for now when a young person comes to you and says, I want to be a deputy prosecutor, or someone we've hired from a class comes to you? What are you looking for, and what advice do you give them?
Well, let me begin by telling you, Dan, that I had this conversation recently with my wife, and a friend was confessing the imposter syndrome that we all can kind of face in our careers at different times. We're like, do people really know how little I know? And it dawned on me that I only have about 5 weeks left to fool people. But after that, they can't pin it on me. I'll have gotten away with it clean. But I think all of us go through our lives oftentimes feeling overwhelmed and insecure sometimes. But I do think the office has changed. I think the way we engage young lawyers has changed, and I think people coming into they're coming into a much more complex practice. But there are more and better people around who are now making a career of doing criminal justice and being prosecutors. And I think we organize those talents in ways to sort of expose young lawyers to a lot more about how to be successful in the practice and how to meet the challenges. And I'm enormously grateful. But the resource becomes the people who have now been here 5, 10, 15, 20 years, really making a career out of something that is worthy of that, and then sharing that with the young lawyers.
So we're less of a beginning of a legal practice that could take you into some of the fancy law firms in town. We're much more of a place where people want to come and really develop their skills as a prosecutor.
I think that's right. And I think we're in a challenging time now, sort of as our country turns and thinks about criminal justice in new ways, but I'm very grateful that we continue to attract people who look at our office, look at who we are, how we practice, and are still attracted to be a part of that.
How do you think that scrutiny of the role of the prosecutors and the concern about mass incarceration, and as well as the balance that we have to do with victims' rights and public safety, how does that all make our job a little more complicated today than it was 35 years ago?
Well, I think that there is additional scrutiny. Two things are, I think, I invite people now or in the past to sort of really look at who, I think oftentimes we have gone through the world sort of misunderstood. People think they know who we are, what we're about, how we practice, and oftentimes what they would have found at any period of time might have been different than what they expect. But there's no doubt that we live in a time now when people are heavily scrutinizing sort of the outcome and the processes of the criminal justice system. Prosecutors are at the leading edge of what gets scrutinized in a lot of these discussions. And I think you and I agree, Dan, that's not something we could be resentful or gee whiz, what about the judges or this or that, but I think it's a good thing.
I think we deserve the scrutiny.
I think we deserve it. I think what we do is important enough that it sort of demands that kind of scrutiny, and I think our job is to sort of be able to say, well, then fine, come inside, look at what we do, look at how we do it. We want to share that with you. There's things we can learn, but there's things that the community can learn too that may be different than what they thought about who we are and how we practice.
Our practice is nuanced in that today you want to know more about the defendant than maybe when we started off. I remember defense attorneys coming in and saying, let me tell you about my guy. We would say, what? We don't want to hear about your guy.
Talking about my guy. It was a punchline, really, to sort of say, oh, we don't really want to hear about your guy. We're just here to talk about just the crime and, how many points he has or whatever it might be. But you're right. It's a very different practice around that now.
How does that affect the life of the deputy prosecutor?
Well, it makes it more difficult, and it makes, as our mission colloquially is to do justice in our practice, it means that we have to ask ourselves different types of questions and sort those things out. I think we're balancing two important considerations, and they're both principles, and they kind of clash with each other. But one is justice demands that we treat similarly situated people the same. What did you do? What's your criminal history? You want to sort of have a sense that you can draw a line between those cases so that people aren't being treated terribly differently. On the other hand, justice demands too that we look at the individual circumstances of cases, and I think we embrace that in a new way. So I think we're always living in that tension, and it is just that. You can't reconcile it perfectly. These are both important principles, and we have to sort of have a foot in both of those.
After only 35 years in the office, you've given your notice that you're going to leave at the end of the year. What do you think you're going to miss the most?
Oh, it's a cliche to say the people.
I know you won't miss the people, but
I will miss the people terribly. And people have asked me over the years, Dan, like, well, what do you like about your job? I settled on an answer maybe 25 years ago, and it still resonates for me today. The work we do, without saying it's everything, it's important. It's important that it be done well. Two, I get to do it with other people. It is, believe it or not, even in a trial practice, what we do as an office of prosecutors, we're really doing we're a community of lawyers and people trying to serve a mission together. And three, I can say very sincerely that I get to do it with people, not just with people, but people who I like and respect deeply. And that's not a guarantee in life that you get those three things. So that sort of is a sense of what has brought me with enthusiasm to the door of the prosecutor's office every morning for 35 years.
So what's it going to look like for you when January comes and you don't have to get up in the morning and commute to Seattle and put on a suit and command an army of 170 lawyers and 170 staff?
The short answer is I don't know, but I want to find out. And I could stay another 5 years easily. I love the place dearly, but I also have a sense too that the office is batons have been passed to me at different times. I can remember Bill Downing and Bob Lasnik literally telling me once, "Hey, this thing's yours now," and speaking to you and I think, and having that sense of that. But I think it's important that leadership be able to do that, and so I'm happy to sort of look at the office and see an office that is prepared to thrive with people in many new people in important leadership positions who are really just growing into those things and doing amazing work, and to say that's a good time. You know, when you feel like the organization is thriving, and to say, I wish you well, and here's the baton, and I'll find other things to do.
You've got a motorcycle that probably whispers your name as you walk by in the garage, and to tell you went on a little sabbatical recently.
You told me, Dan, that was you gave me 6 weeks to go explore, and in 35 years I'd never taken 6 weeks off, and I came back and I liked it. But I will.
It was a bad move on my part.
It was a bad move on your part. I don't think so. But there are other things to do. There's other challenges. It'll be really fun to spend a year sort of figuring out what that next life is like, how that feels. And I have no regrets moving into that, but I'm also very aware of what a large change it represents too. And so I'm just opening my mind and my heart to know that that's going to be filled with good things.
Well, on behalf of the 2.2 million people in King County, all of whom could be watching this show right now,
yes,
I want to say thank you for your friendship, your partnership, for your leadership, and your hard work for 35 years doing justice. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Daniel.
And you've been with us for another edition of the Prosecutor's Partners. Tune in again, and we'll introduce you to some more people who are making a difference in your community. Thank you.